All right. Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to This Week in Review, Founder of the Day's weekly analysis of the last 7 days of the week, which each had an American founder. Thank you so much for coming. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're all hitting like on the way in. Make sure you do that. And definitely subscribe if you're new here. Though I have a feeling that most of you have been here. I apologize. I moved the microphone. That probably sounded terrible. I almost forgot to take off my hat. But don't have time to do my hair now. Whoopsie daisy. Welcome. I did change up my setup a little bit this week, so let's see how everything works out by going to our first founder. Although, before we do, I want to note that we are going to talk a lot about feudalism in New York this week. The first founder, Peter Van Brugge Livingston, inspired me to look a little bit more into feudalism during the early republic in New York State. And then I did that, and the last two founders we talk about are also relevant to that. But we're also going to talk a lot about relations with Spain and the Mississippi River in the years following the Revolutionary War. I also want to note that tomorrow, Thursday, I'm going to do something a little special. Usually I don't go live on Thursdays. I go live on Friday and Wednesdays, like right now. I am actually going to be going live tomorrow because I am releasing my annual Founders Fantasy Draft list. What is it called? The name escapes me. Rankings. My fantasy rankings for American founders. Now, I'm about 2 months late this year. It takes kind of a lot of work, but you or someone you know may play fantasy football or baseball or blah, blah, blah sports. And I thought it would be fun a few years back to make a list of American founders and their draft. So tomorrow I am going live and I'm going to discuss as quickly as I can my top 100 American founders in order. It's going to be fun. I'm going to go through it as quick as I can. But that's tomorrow, so make sure you subscribe and come back 8:15 as per usual. But we are going to start right now with Peter Van Brugge Livingston. And I hope I hit the right scene. I did. Everything looks great. Excellent. So, Peter Van Brugge Livingston. Here he is. He's a good-looking gentleman. And a gentleman he was. He was a member of the Livingston family. Now, the Livingston families, as we've discussed before, and you may know, had a ton of fun founders. I'm going to bring myself back here. So, first of all, Peter Van Brugge Livingston had two younger brothers. One older brother, Philip, who signed the Declaration of Independence, and one younger brother, William, who signed the United States Constitution. Now, Peter didn't sign any fun things to talk about. He, like many founders, stuck to his state, which was New York. He also had another brother, an older brother, Robert, who was the Lord of Livingston Manor. As I said, we're going to talk about manors a little bit later in the video. But so from a super wealthy family, owned a ton of property, had just so many founders working under him. I am going to take off my hat. It is bothering me in the corner. I apologize. I forgot to take it off. My hair looks great. We're going to have to deal with this. So, Peter goes, the revolution breaks out, and Peter's already serving in the New York Assembly. And what happens is once the revolution breaks out, he joins the Committee of 100. In New York, they did things a little bit differently, of course. They had a Committee of 51 that organized to complain about Britain and send people to the First Continental Congress, and then that turned into the Committee of 60, which was the same thing but with a few more people, and then that turned into a Committee of 100, which was the same thing, but now independence had been declared. And Peter Van Brugge Livingston actually was appointed a chairperson of that committee. Furthermore, he would go on to, after the new Constitution was written, they changed things up, got rid of the Committee of 100, and got the New York State Assembly, of which Peter Livingston became president. He was also ended up being chairman of the Committee of Safety that took over. And for 6 months, over the winter of 1776, 1777, as soon as the British took over and took control of New York City, he was also put in charge as treasurer of New York State. So for 6 months, Peter Van Brugge Livingston was the most important member of New York State. He wasn't governor, but he ran the legislature, he ran the militia, and he controlled the finances. This was a very trying time. It was the time as they were creating the New York State Constitution, and Peter Vanbrugh Livingston, who was already an older gentleman, as most of the Livingston family was, helped usher in a new New York. And after which he retired, approaching 70 years old at this point, retired in 1777, I believe it was, or 1778. I think it was 1777. He retires to a little fanfare and goes and lives on his mansion. And if I'm not mistaken, he actually had a property burned. Or am I confusing him with last week's Richard Morris? No, yes, I was thinking of Richard Morris from last week, who, as I said, Richard Morris, also from New York, had a younger brother that signed the Declaration and another younger brother that signed the Constitution, which is what kind of led me to this gentleman. I'm researching a lot about New York State. Call me self-centered. I'm living here now. So unless there's any questions, I'm going to move on to our next founder. And as always, this is from Friday, and Fridays are currently Anti-Federalist Fridays. And we are going to discuss this gentleman who you might recognize as the one and the only Patrick the Henry Anti-Federalist, as I've labeled him here. And we're talking about it wasn't a paper, it was a speech he gave during the, he gave a speech at the ratification convention for the Constitution in Virginia. And Patrick Henry was a leading anti-federalist and leading on the floor of Virginia, at the time the biggest, wealthiest, most powerful, and arguably most important state in the Union. It was a very close vote. I was 189 to 179, if I'm not mistaken, which means 6 people vote differently, and this body of over 300 people turns down the Constitution instead of accepts it, which would be a huge transition. Now, the name of this his speech was published and is now known from publication as Foreign Wars, Civil Wars, and Indian Wars, 3 Bugbears. Now I'm going to bring this back to me real quick. I want to do a side note. He calls them bugbears, which is a term I had never experienced before. You might recognize it, but I certainly had never heard of bugbears in my life. Turns out it is essentially a boogeyman, or a hobgoblin, or some combination thereof. Either way, something you're told to be scared of, but isn't really a real thing. Like, I don't know. I'm going to say this, but I hope I don't offend anyone. I was going to say, like, Bigfoot, but I understand that can be a controversial thing to say. So, not Bigfoot. We'll leave it at hobgoblins. If you believe in hobgoblins, well, I hope that's not offensive. I hope it's not a religious thing, is it? Oh, well, it doesn't matter. So, Patrick Henry gets on the floor of the United States Congress. On the floor of the Virginia Ratification Convention. And he says, we've been told of 3 things. And I want to note, a few weeks back, we discussed William Grayson, who wrote the or gave a speech in the same Congress that was later published as an anti-federalist paper called We Have Been Told of Phantoms. And Patrick Henry echoes a lot of his things. And what's interesting is Patrick Henry says some things that are kind of objectively wrong during this whole thing. So first, he talks about 3 types of war that the Constitution is warning about. First, he talks about foreign wars. And he goes through pretty significantly regarding each individual country that we should be worried about. He's like, France just gave us all this money. They know we owe them money, and they know we'll pay them off eventually. Well, they didn't. He knows. He talks about the Netherlands, who were happy to loan us more money. He talks about Spain, who we're going to get into. Actually, reading this anti-federalist paper made me curious about a certain treaty, the Jay-Gardoki Treaty. We are going to talk about that. And he talks about how the Articles of Confederation let them vote down this particular treaty, the Jay-Gardoki Treaty, because in the treaty, Spain says you can't use the Mississippi to trade. And we were able to turn it down because they didn't have enough votes for it. As a way to promote the Articles of Confederation as a government that's fine, just fine. Needs some work, but is pretty much fine, just fine. He talks about England, who's we just beat them in a war without any government. So there's that. And then, and I'm sure there's nations I'm leaving out that he specifically discusses. So he's like, I'm not worried about foreign wars. We work together pretty well when we have to as colonies. Then he talks about civil wars, which he's like, we just fought a war together on our own volition. Like, we have had scuffles in the past, but primarily we work together. Like, we're not worried about Pennsylvania invading Virginia, and we're not worried about South Carolina invading Virginia. And again, you want to keep in mind that the Anti-Federalists were not just necessarily just against the Constitution. They were for their states having the power because they ran their states and wanted to hold on to said power. So Patrick Henry, he doesn't necessarily want to concede this power. And Virginia is powerful, has so many people and so much money, and one of the most powerful state militias. So therefore, when it comes to civil wars, his attitude seems like, if it happens, it happens. We're not worried. But primarily saying it doesn't happen, we work together. And this is interesting because he puts aside several things, but like notably, this is just after the Pennite Yankee War, Pennite Yankee War, it's often called, which was a battle that kind of broke out, a skirmish, I should call it, that broke out in northeastern Pennsylvania, the corner between New York and New Jersey. So the thing is, Connecticut used to have a charter that said Connecticut went from where it is now, you got Connecticut on a map now, and then you got New York, and then Connecticut was supposed to skip over New York and then extend all the way to the Pacific Ocean, which includes about the top third of Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvanians were like, no. Notably, the people who lived in what's called the Wyoming Valley, and it's not Wyoming like the state. Wyoming Valley is a section of Pennsylvania in the northeast corner on the Delaware, right there by New York and New Jersey, as I said. The people of Wyoming were considered themselves Pennsylvanians, and there were actually a few battles or skirmishes that broke out in what is commonly referred to as the Pennite Yankee War. The Pennites being Pennsylvanians, and the Yankees being those Connecticuters. And this happened like 2 years before Patrick Henry is saying, we don't get into fights with each other. What are you talking about? So he kind of conveniently leaves that out. I see people leaving. I apologize if I'm offending you if you're a Patrick Henry fan. I'm not trying to trash Patrick Henry. Just trying to look objectively at what happened. And that's Civil War. So that's foreign wars and civil wars. And then lastly, he discusses Indian wars. And in this, he says, I hear every day from the frontier that the natives are being more and more polite to us and starting to be more welcoming, especially now that we won the Revolutionary War. They don't have the British helping them. The French aren't there helping them anymore. He kind of ignores the Spanish who were there. Although, to be fair, as we will discuss later, the Spanish were willing to help kind of clear out the Native Americans. And he's also ignoring the fact that this is the days leading up to the Northwest Indian War, as it's called, which was the American army fighting the Native Americans in the Northwest Territory, which was a long war, like 7 years, almost as long as the American Revolution itself, or the Revolutionary War itself. So that. Now, I did want to note one thing that I like to remind people, that Thomas Jefferson was not around for this discussion. Thomas Jefferson was in Spain this whole time. And, we can read letters he wrote back questioning things, saying, what are you talking about, James Madison, my protege? What's this Constitution you're writing? And Patrick Henry in this speech actually refers specifically to Thomas Jefferson. He's calling him, our favorite ambassador and things like that, but he's talking about Thomas Jefferson. And he actually says, and I'm going to quote here, that he indicates in France, earlier in his speech when he's talking about foreign wars, saying how France is happy with the United States, he says, Thomas Jefferson tells me they're happy. And he actually says, talking about the United States Constitution, he says, quote, his opinion is that you reject this government. And this is interesting for a few reasons. First of all, he's using the weight of Thomas Jefferson's opinion to reject the Constitution. Granted, as an ambassador in Europe and talking on behalf of someone seeing how Europe feels, that is essentially what he's referring to. But at the same time, this is Patrick Henry. This is the guy who, like, give me liberty or give me death just a decade beforehand. This is a guy who led troops towards battle. The battle didn't happen, but, this is one of the most important leaders of Virginia. One of, as I said, the most important states. So the fact that he's defaulting to Thomas Jefferson's opinion is very interesting. Again, it's specifically in France, but it's very interesting that he brings Jefferson up. It's like, by the way, don't forget about him. He's on my side. At this point, Jefferson had made a name for himself. The authorship of the Declaration of Independence had started to become pretty well known at that point. So anyway, that is the three bugbears as Patrick Henry. So I want to say elegantly put it. So I'm going to take a sip of water. If there's any questions, we are going to move on to Richard Beresford. Beresford. I can't say his name for some reason. Now, crank. Richard, there's no great image of him, so I went with that. And Richard Beresford makes 9. I always want to say a G, a Beresford. It's not. Beresford. Richard Beresford makes 9. So Richard Beresford is himself extremely interesting. We have a young man who goes to England, London, to study law. He grows up in South Carolina, goes to London to study law, studies law, comes back from South Carolina. And when he gets back, it's 1778, and there's a war that started in his absence. So, what do you know? He, when he gets to the gate, the British there are like, hey, if you want to enter, we don't have documentation of exactly how it went down, but presumably, like, swear an oath of allegiance, although that is me speculating. We don't know what he was asked to do, but he did verify that he loved Great Britain and leaves. And as soon as he gets off the ship and leaves, he goes right to Philadelphia and talks to Henry Lawrence, who's the sitting president of the Continental Congress. He sits down with Henry Lawrence, both of these gentlemen from South Carolina. He says, hey, I just got off a boat, and they said, I heard some people talking about an invasion of Charleston. And you can actually see the letter. Henry Lawrence writes about the whole interaction in a letter that he sends to George Washington. Like, Richard came in, shut the door, and sat down at my desk and started talking about this thing. And they made preparations to try and defend Charleston. It doesn't end up working. Although Beresford gets up and leaves Philadelphia and goes back to South Carolina and joins the militia to defend Charleston from the British invasion. And he ends up becoming an aide-de-camp to, let me see. Let me make sure I know. William Moultrie. My apologies. Beresford ends up becoming an aide-de-camp to William Moultrie, and they try and defend South Carolina. It doesn't work. Beresford is brought with the many captured people of Charleston to join the captured people of Savannah in prison for about a year until eventually they're released after Yorktown. So Beresford then he joins the state assembly and is then quickly elected as lieutenant governor of South Carolina. But he actually leaves this position when he's elected to the Continental Congress, which is super interesting because a lot of people left the Continental Congress to go do things like be lieutenant governor. Not a lot of people dropped out of running their state to join the Continental Congress. At this time, under the Articles of Confederation, so historically we call it the Articles of Confederation. It's the Confederation Congress. I can never get it out. Or the Congress of the Confederation. But they called it the Continental Congress. Not a lot of people left a state government job to go to the, I don't even want to say federal government, to go to the League of Nations over here and hang out for a while. But he did. And it's interesting that he did because he goes and then he gets sick, unfortunately. But while he's sick, my understanding is while he's sick, the Congress changes cities to Baltimore. And he actually, despite being ill, gets up and goes to Baltimore because they have the Treaty of Peace. The Treaty of Paris has arrived, and for the Articles of Confederation to ratify it, for the Continental Congress to ratify the Treaty of Peace in 1784 and finally actually physically end the war, they need 2 delegates from 9 colonies. And they can only seem to get 2 delegates from 8 colonies and 1 dude from South Carolina. And what do you know? Richard Beresford, despite a pretty serious illness, it sounds like, gets up and travels to Baltimore and makes a quorum of the necessary 9 states to sign the Treaty of Paris and end the War of American Independence. And we have Richard Beresford to thank for the treaty actually, finally, after sitting around for a few weeks, actually finally getting signed. And this random gentleman that I'm sure most of you have never heard of, was the person who made it possible to actually finally end the Revolutionary War. I think he's a fascinating character. I hope you do too. So let's keep moving on. We're moving right along, and I feel like it's going to take a little bit longer at the end this week because I got a lot to say about feudalism in New York State. I will pop this up, and you will see Richard Dobbs Speight. Just a fantastic name, if I've ever heard one. And I've heard a few. So this is Richard Dobbs Speight. I'll scroll down so my head's not in the way so much. Look at him. Nice guy. Nice guy. But, you want to talk about him? Come back to me. Here we go. So Richard Dobbs Speight was orphaned as a very young man in Ireland. And he grew up there, and when he's about 20 years old, he gets on a ship and sails to America because he sees opportunity here. And much like Richard Beresford, whose name I can't say, much like Richard Beresford, who sailed into the Carolinas in 1778, so too did Richard Dobbs Speight. Though Speight ends up coming into North Carolina and immediately joins the war effort. And he becomes an aide-de-camp to Richard Caswell. Richard Caswell would go on to be a governor of North Carolina. He would also serve as a major general in the state militia. He was unfortunately part of the Battle of Camden, which didn't work out very well. And this is how this immigrant makes a name for himself. Somehow he weasels his way into the care of Richard Dobbs Speight. Excuse me. He did. Oh, that's right. He did receive a good education. I was looking to see if he was a physician, but he wasn't. He does seem to have gotten a good education from extended family while in Ireland, which way he can make his way up. Richard Dobbs Speight then serves in the military. He ends up joining the state assembly, and then he's sent to this thing called the Constitutional Convention on behalf of North Carolina. Again, he had only been in the United States for about 9 years, and he was still in his late 20s when North Carolina sent him to what they thought was going to be a discussion amending the Articles of Confederation. It ended up being the United States Constitution, which North Carolina was one of the 2 states with Rhode Island that was very much opposed to the Constitution. In fact, their first convention voted against ratification. Richard Dobbs Speight, however, representing North Carolina, ends up signing the United States Constitution. So if it's a name, this name you may have heard of if you've ever read the signatures on the U.S. Constitution. He is one of them. Now, after going to the Constitutional Convention, this immigrant ends up running for, I don't mean to say immigrant like, it's a bad thing. It's just you often don't hear, even back then, people coming from other countries rising through the ranks to running for governor of North Carolina so quickly. And he did. Richard Dobbs Speight ran for North Carolina, but he lost. He goes to the North Carolina Ratification Convention I was discussing and votes for it because he signed it, but he's outvoted. Eventually, he ends up becoming he tries to become a senator once North Carolina finally ratifies the United States Constitution. This guy who helped write it was like, why don't you send me as a senator? And they were like, no. Much very similar to what happened with James Madison, actually. James Madison, obviously, major contributor to the creation of the United States Constitution, goes home expecting to be given a senatorship at a time when senators were appointed by the state. They were not elected by the public like they are now. And much like James Madison, the state said, people running the state said, well, you won your Constitution that we don't necessarily care for, but we're not going to let you represent us like that. How dare you? Finally, in 1792, Richard Dobbs Speight, luck turns around and he is elected governor of North Carolina. Again, having been in the state in North America less than 15 years, he's elected governor of North Carolina. While there's not a lot of achievements under his administration, he is the person who's in charge when the University of North Carolina is established. So he does have that to his name. And then, after 3 years of governor, like many states at the time, you had a 3-year term limit, a limit of 3 one-year terms as governor consecutively. So he loses, technically it's, you could be governor 3 one-year terms, and then you have to wait 3 years, and then you can be governor again. So he's governor for 3 years, and after this, he's finally elected to the United States House of Representatives, and he is there for a while. He goes as a Federalist because he initially sided, as I said, as one of the few North Carolinians who actually supported the United States Constitution. He was kind of naturally a Federalist, but once he gets to the government as a Southerner, he ends up siding more with the Democratic Republicans, and he does switch sides. Unfortunately, he gets in a little bit of trouble for flip-flopping, and then he's not sent back. Flip-flopping is a more modern term that actually has fallen out of use. Who was it? Was it John Kerry? I don't remember. I don't want to talk about modern politics, but you remember flip-flopping? It wasn't that long ago that everyone was talking about flip-flopping. And Richard Dobbs Speight was accused of exactly this. He was actually, the gentleman's name was Stanley, John Stanley. There was his rival, John Stanley, accused him of flip-flopping, essentially, publicly. So Richard Dobbs Speight did what any gentleman would do, and he challenged him to a duel, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, this duel is unlike most of the duels we're accustomed to hearing about back then, because unlike most duels that were done quietly in the early morning, out of the public eye, and kind of kept hush-hush unless someone dies, this one was done in front of hundreds of people. The phrase I've been able to find is hundreds of people came to watch these guys duel. And they had 3 volleys each. So they each fired 3 times, and no one was hurt. And they said, the crowd begged them to stop. Like, you did it. We get it. Everyone's honor's intact. Everything's cool. Go home. And Speight refused. And the 4th time, he got shot. And the next day, he died. So while we like to look at Alexander Hamilton as a signer of the Constitution who was killed in a duel, he's not the only one. Richard Dobbs Speight, a former governor of North Carolina and signer of the U.S. Constitution, was killed in a duel publicly. He died the next day, but he was shot in front of a lot of people. Which I don't know why I'm laughing at it. I think enough time has elapsed that he will forgive me. But it was a lot of people. Anyway, that's Richard Dobbs Speight. As always, feel free to ask any questions. I'm going to take a sip of water real quick, and we are going to go to the Jay-Gardoqui Treaty, and we're going to take a look. Now, this fine gentleman you see here is Diego de Gardoqui. As you can see, I started writing people's names and fun stuff on the thumbnails. Spanish minister to the United States of 1784 to 89. The Jay-Gardoqui Treaty, an agreement that never was. I'm going to bring you guys back to me here. The Jay-Gardoqui, so Diego de Gardoqui comes to the United States in 1784, just after independence is declared, and he is the official minister representing Spain to the throne of the United States, so to speak. He gets there, and he's fairly well known by many people. I actually read some correspondence between him and John Adams while I was researching this. John Adams knew him because Gardoqui, actually, I should say, John Jay knew him best because John Jay had gone to Spain during the American Revolution, which is always overlooked. And while he's in Spain, the Kingdom of Spain is very difficult to work with, both during and after the American Revolution, though the king does grant certain permissions, and he permits certain major corporations to sell ammunition and other supplies to the Americans on credit to help win the war, because everyone hates Britain. Now, one of the major sellers of products to the United States was Gardoki and Sons. And today's subject, Diego de Gardoki, was one of these sons. Gardoki and Sons. His father was in charge, but Gardoki made friends with John Jay and vicariously the other Americans in Europe. And they ended up, Gardoki's family sent, I forget exact, tens of thousands of weapons, tens of thousands of uniforms. It was like 30,000 guns, 30,000 uniforms, 250 cannons, 500,000 musket balls, 30,000 bayonets. I'm like remembering it as I go. And like 250 cannons. So this family sent a lot of weaponry and uniforms and powder, which is super important, to the United States to help win the war. Again, it wasn't Spain that did this. It was an individual family. But once America becomes an independent nation, Spain recognizes America as an independent nation. And who do they send as their ambassador? One of the sons of this family that the Americans obviously like, and who has made quite a bit of money off the United States already. Seems like a good representative, and he was. He's in America for about 5 years, and he talks to primarily John Jay, which, side note, the book of the week this week is John Jay by Walter Starr. There's a link in the description below. It's a fantastic book about one of the most underappreciated founders. Like I said, tomorrow I'm doing my list of top 100 American founders if you're doing a fantasy draft, so tune in for that because I assure you, Jay is pretty high on the list. One of the most underappreciated Americans of all time. But either way, Gardoki comes in, and John Jay is the United States Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Continental Congress, even though there's not a lot he can do. He has a great relationship with Gardoki, and they come up with this treaty that makes a lot of sense. It's called the Jay-Gardoki Treaty, and they basically says that America gets most favored nation status, so they can trade in all sorts of Spanish ports, essentially around the world, which opens up a lot for America, because although by the time of the American Revolution, the two powers on the sea, Britain was the number one powerhouse in the world, and Spain and France was number two. Spain was three, though, arguably, with Holland, but Spain had been, for hundreds of years, the powerhouse, and they were only a few decades removed from being the most powerful. Like, think about it. Like, most of South America, all of Central America, and Mexico all speak Spanish. Most of the Caribbean all speak Spanish because Spain ran the world. They were really the first country on which the sun never set. So they're opening up most of their ports to the Americans, and they're also saying that they will help in the Northwest Territory because, again, the Native Americans up there were not being super cool, and the British, even though they had ceded the Northwest Territory in the Treaty of Paris, which was just being signed at this point, they were still kept forts. They still kept their men in the forts in the Northwest Territory for a while. And Spain said, we'll help you clear them out. Absolutely. Again, Spain had fought not with the Americans during the Revolution, kind of with the Americans. Bernardo de Galvez has been granted honorary American citizenship. He's only one of maybe a dozen people in the history of the world to be granted honorary citizenship. Galvez was the governor of Louisiana and did work with the Americans although Spain didn't so much want to help the Americans beat the British like the French did, as they just wanted to have an opportunity to attack the British. There it was. Now, this treaty sounds fine, and it sounded great to people in the North, but there was one major flaw. That major flaw was the King of Spain said in no fashion at all are you allowed to grant the Americans the right to travel the Mississippi. The right to navigate the Mississippi River shall not be a part of any treaty we sign. The Americans said, we're not going to sign any treaty unless we can navigate the Mississippi River. Now, you could see how this would be a problem, and it was a problem. And despite about 5 years of discussions, it remained a problem. And that's why this is what I call the treaty that never was, because they wrote it pretty quickly and just could not get it passed. Now, why Spain didn't want the Americans to use the Mississippi while they were allowing them to use other ports is a little bit of a mystery to me. It seems to be in large part a power thing, like this is our waterway for us. You can get your goods out another way, come sell them in New Orleans, but you can't travel on our water. I do think a large part of it was because opening it up to anyone means that other people, the British might want to come down from Canada, things like that. There were a variety of reasons. Now, the reasons for the Americans wanting to use it are fairly obvious. On this side of the Appalachian Mountains, on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains, it was very difficult to bring your stuff back over the mountain. So if you were a farmer growing wheat or something like that, it'd be much easier to put your wheat on a boat and sail it down the Mississippi River than to get it over the mountains, which is almost impossible. And side note, a decade later, this would lead to in large part to the Whiskey Rebellion, because since the farmers in western Pennsylvania and western Virginia couldn't sell their wheat or their rye or whatever products they were growing that you make whiskey with, they wanted to just sell it wholesale and sail it down the river. Hi, Braden, how you doing? They sailed down the river, but they couldn't sell it down the river because the Spanish closed off the river. So instead, they were forced to take a little bit of a loss by bottling it as whiskey, and because whiskey could more easily be transported over the mountains, and then they would have to sell for a higher price than the bottlers on the East Coast, the wealthy elites on the East Coast, which caused a problem then as now, one might argue. Now, let's just breeze past that. Going back to the Spanish, so this becomes a real problem because the people in west of the Appalachians, people in Kentucky, people in what's going to be Tennessee, but they were then calling themselves the state of Franklin because they wanted to be their own state, and they thought if we name ourselves after Benjamin Franklin, that it would be great. And then Ben Franklin literally contacted them and was like, thanks for the honor, but like, I see what you're doing here. Don't name it after me. That's, again, another interesting story that we won't get too into. But either way, we have these people living over here right next to Spain. They want to use the Mississippi River. Spain has access to the Mississippi River, and America doesn't. And while much of this territory was ceded from the states that originally owned them to the United States under the Articles of Confederation, the people living there were trying to become a state, and even some of them were considering becoming independent countries, as the state of Franklin tried to do, as happened on several occasions. During this time, there's a gentleman named James Wilkinson, and I'm not going to get too into Slippery Jim today, but suffice to say, he's one of America's great villains, and this is about a decade and a half before he becomes Senior General of the United States Army. He would go on to spend a significant amount of time as the commander of the United States Army. And this is about the time he became a secret agent for the Spanish. He would be a double agent while leading the United States Army out of New Orleans. Agent 13, it's true, look it up. Again, I'm not going to get too into Slippery Jim today. But James Wilkinson, not a great dude. Either way, he goes to, he gets involved with all this. He starts communicating with Spain and New Orleans, but also a little bit Garidoki. And Wilkinson becomes a leader with John Sevier, I believe it's pronounced, who I still need to write about, in ceding from the United States, and instead of becoming an independent nation of their own, actually siding with Spain. And it gets remarkably close to this happening until essentially the United States Constitution comes around in the middle of all this. And once the Constitution comes around, now suddenly places like Kentucky and Tennessee see a pathway to statehood, which they didn't see beforehand under the Articles of Confederation. No new states would enter the Union under the Articles of Confederation. But within, 6 years, under the Constitution, you get Vermont, Kentucky, Virginia, and then, Ohio pops in not far after that, and things of that nature. Either way, it's great. Anywho, that is essentially the Jay Gardoki Treaty. So at the end there, Gardoki ends up leaving in 1789 because he's like, obviously this is never going to get done. I've tried for 5 years, it's not going to get done. But I do want to note that this whole time, under the Articles of Confederation, the Confederation Congress is meeting in New York City. So the whole time, Gardoki's staying in New York City. And now, as a Spanish person, he's a Catholic. But again, going into and coming out of the American Revolution, each state essentially had its own religion going on, and there wasn't a lot of crossing and really not a lot of Catholicism going on at all. But New York was becoming a major metropolitan area. And during this time, Gardoki, as a Catholic, wanted to hold Mass, and he did. And his house became the first de facto Catholic cathedral in New York City. Now, cathedral is obviously the wrong word. I said it, and as soon as I said it, I didn't mean it. A cathedral is a very particularly designed building, but it's where Mass was held. So he would come, the French and Portuguese ministers would come, and Catholic Maryland sent some of its people. For example, the Carroll brothers, specifically Daniel. There's several Carroll brothers. One of them signed the Declaration of Independence. One of them was the first minister. They came through, as did, why does the name escape me? Thomas Fitzsimmons, who was the Catholic that signed the United States Constitution, would be there. And so Catholicism was really there for a while. And Gardoki, so he actually was the one that laid the cornerstone for St. Peter's Church, which was the first Catholic church built in New York City. I guess that you could call a cathedral. I do see some comments coming in. Well, before we move on at the end there. Yeah, no problem, Brent. Post the live stream. Yeah, I can try to post the live stream. I don't know a ton about posting the live stream. I know it comes up under live from my view. I'll check it out. I will try and post it. Is there a place you want me to post it? Like an internet place? What's the word? On the internet, and I lost my place here. There we go. Now, I'm gonna take a drink of water, and then we are going to talk about manners in New York, as I promised. We're gonna talk about New York a lot today. I'm sorry, this is just the topic I got in on. And, I know we just were talking about New York City, but that's not fair. That topic was about the West and Spain. It just happened to end in New York City, where all the talks were taking place. So we're going to talk about two people here, but before we get into the next two people, I want to give you a little, I kind of went off on a weird tangent this week with my research. I spend a lot of time in the years between 1762 and 1824. A lot of time. And I love it. And I love it. And I love talking about it to you guys and writing about it. It's the great honor of my life that people will come see this. Also, getting married and having children. I should probably put there, there's a list in there somewhere. But I got a little off because I went too far back to the early 1600s and New York State. And so, I live in upstate New York, though where I live technically was on the far side of the proclamation line of 1862. I live in Native American territory, technically. Obviously not anymore. Decisions were made. But the Hudson River is an extraordinarily important part of American history. The New York City we have and love today, or hate today, depending on who you are and your opinions, we have because of the Hudson River. It's often overlooked that Albany, New York is, my understanding, the oldest continuously inhabited city in the United States. It wasn't a city at first. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I don't want to say continuously inhabited settlement, but either way, it's been inhabited a long time. It's very important, and it was Dutch. Netherlands went out and got some colonies too. They obviously weren't so good at it, but they got some colonies and they sent them out and they got New York. And Henry Hudson had gone up the Hudson River, said it's pretty cool. Some of the Dutch people came, worked with Native Americans and some of the French. It seems that there may have already been a French fort in where Albany is now, but either way, they come up, they establish Albany. And what Netherlands does is super interesting. They essentially put the Dutch East India Company in charge of all the land because they want to make money with their colonies. What they do is they grant what's called patroonships. Most of these were given to former members of the board of the company, and patroonships would later, when the English take over, become lords. A patroon would later become a lord. As in a lord of a manor, as in feudal times in Europe before the plague showed up. So, and this sounds hard to believe. It really, I still like, I've been reading about it all week and I'm still like having trouble dealing with it because it was already kind of an outdated system, but they wanted to settle this land and make it profitable. So they gave a few wealthy people ownership of massive amounts of land. And like, honestly, I'm going to see if I can bring up the map because I should have done this ahead of time. I'm sorry. Manors of New York. I was looking at it. And what's fascinating about it is they grant these patroonships. No. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to keep going. What's really fascinating about it, map of manors, is that it? Is that these, here it is. I found it. I'm going to bring it back up while I talk because I think this is extraordinary. Come on, grow, get bigger. So this is the Manor of New York. I threw myself off a little bit. I apologize. Not the best. Dead air. What am I doing here? They granted these manors to a handful of wealthy people, and these wealthy people were given all this land and said, make it profitable. They were able to appoint every office, every judge, everything. They were completely in charge of this land. They were also supposed to try and convince people to go there and settle, and they would fill ships with people who were willing to go out there and move them there, and the people would be able to rent land, and because this is up until not long ago, like 90% of people were farmers. Even during the American Revolution, like 80 to 90% of everyone was a farmer. So they would rent this farmland to tenant farmers who would then pay off either in cash or with their crops their rent. But because of this, it was literally a feudal society. It was serfdom. They were serfs to the land. Now, they weren't tied to the land like serfs might be. They could leave, although if they left, they had to sell their ownership of the rent, and the landlord would take advantage of this. And just to point this out, like, if you look at this map here, this is a significant part. It's most of Long Island. There's a few smaller ones down south. And you'll recognize some of these names, like Livingston Manor, which we spoke about the Livingstons today, didn't we? And we're about to speak about Rensselaerswyck. This is a huge swath of land here. The Rensselaerswyck Manor. By far the biggest and one of the earliest. And now we will get into today's discussion. Rensselaerswyck. So Rensselaerswyck is started in like the early 1600s. Again, a huge swath of land owned by one person, and it's passed down for generations, patroon to patroon, until the English take over and it becomes a manor. And you are the lord, literally a feudal lord of the manor. Eventually, one of these feudal lords dies and is passed down to his son, but his son is only 5 years old, and his son is Stephen Van Rensselaer III. So this person is Abraham ten Broek. He is the brother-in-law of the man who dies, and he is put in charge of Rensselaerswyck until the next heir comes to take over. Until Stephen, young Stephen, grows up and can take over Rensselaerswyck Manor and be in charge of thousands of people. So, and again, we talk like about elites nowadays, and like elites back then, like these were like as elite as you can get. They literally owned everyone's house. Like, they weren't slaves. There were slaves. I should know. There were slaves, but my understanding is generally in this part of New York, the slaves that were held by the lord of the manor and were rented out to the tenant farmers to help them do the farming as need be. Again, slavery, totally wrong. Never going to justify it. Not my thing. Not justifying it. But because of it, slavery finds this weird spot in New York that's kind of a mix of New England and the South. Because New England, slavery is generally just one or two slaves to the wealthiest families who treat them as a member of the family to help them go about their daily work. And in the South, you know, as is largely known, it was mostly gigantic plantations filled with slaves doing massive amounts of labor for a very small amount of white elites. in New York, it's strange because you have this very there's not a there's not as many there's more slaves than most New England houses, but not generally not nearly as much as you see in the South. But they're also not usually working. They do work in the house as servants, obviously for the wealthy elite, but many of them are mostly rented out to help the essentially slave or serf white people who are working the land. I don't mean slave, they serfs. They were generally indentured and could buy their way out eventually, as I said. But either way, Abraham Ten Broeck takes over from one of these for Rensselaerswyck, this gigantic. I'm not sure how I got off on that tangent. This gigantic piece of land when his brother-in-law passed away, and he's supposed to hold it for 15 years till his nephew comes of age. While during this time, the American Revolution breaks out. The 1769 takes over. Shortly thereafter, the American Revolution breaks out. Broeck himself was fairly wealthy and from a wealthy family, and marrying into the Rensselaers indicates exactly how wealthy he actually was. And he's a leader before and during and after the American Revolution. He goes on to become mayor of Albany for several years. Again, Albany is almost as populated as New York City at this point, and a very important city in colonial and early Republic America, as well as New York, because it was right on the Hudson. In fact, the British came down the Hudson and took Fort Ticonderoga, and the famous Battle of Saratoga, which changed France's mind to come help us, breaks out just north of Albany. And Abraham Ten Broeck, this particular founder, was a colonel in the state militia already, and he actually brought his men out in Broeck's Brigade. I think it's Broeck's Brigade is how it's pronounced. And he goes and leads men at the Battle of Saratoga, because Saratoga was fought for Albany. Because if the Americans lose Saratoga, John Burgoyne's goal was to take the city of Albany, essentially splitting off New England from the South. Although I have heard arguments that it would not necessarily have worked quite as planned, especially because Clinton didn't bring his army up the Hudson. That's not the point. Either way, he does defend his city. He leads men to defend the city. Almost all of these men, by the way, were farmers and people who live on the land he owns. But, that's why it's hard to compare it to old serfdom from back in the day, where, like, you didn't have a say. You did what you were told by the lord of your manor. It wasn't exactly the same in New York, and things were obviously changing at a very rapid pace. Shortly after that, 1784, like I said, he led men in battle. He was mayor of Albany during this, and he was in control of Rensselaerswyck. And then in 1784, he passes off Rensselaerswyck to Stephen Van Rensselaer III, who is the actual lord of Rensselaerswyck, which is the name of the Rensselaer Manor. And Stephen takes over. Abraham Ten Broeck goes back to just his regular life of being a very wealthy merchant, and would temporarily serve as mayor again later in life, but kind of steps out of the public eye after the war is over. But that brings us to our next founder, and that is Stephen Van Rensselaer III. Now, this guy is fascinating. He ends up being, adjusted for inflation, the 10th wealthiest American ever. Adjusted for inflation, he is the 10th wealthiest American of all time. Arguably, obviously, if you do economics a certain way, you can narrow him down the list, but you're not dropping him past 15. This guy had so much money. So, as I said, his uncle, Stephen was 5 years old when his father dies. And his uncle, Abraham Ten Broeck, takes over for 15 years, the estate, while Stephen Van Rensselaer is raised to be in charge of tens of thousands of people. It's not just like, oh, your family's elite and you have the opportunity to be a leader when you grow up. No. He was raised as a lord, as nobility was in Europe. You are nobility in New York. You run this feudal manor of, hundreds of thousands of acres. I don't know exactly how big it was, but you saw the map, big. It's more than Albany County nowadays. It's almost 2 entire counties in New York. New York's bigger than it looks. For those of you not from around here, upstate is very big. Though I'm sure our friends in like Montana will laugh at me for saying that. Either way, Stephen Van Rensselaer takes over, and he almost immediately, in his early 20s, first of all, he marries a woman named Peggy Schuyler, which if you've seen or heard the Hamilton musical, you will recognize the name Peggy Schuyler as the annoying third Schuyler sister in the play, but she actually wasn't annoying. She was a very intelligent person, and I will give her her own day fairly soon. Actually, I need to call Jesse to talk to her about the Schuylers. That's not the point. He marries into the Schuyler family, so his brother-in-law is Alexander Hamilton and John Baker Church, but not nearly as exciting to hear about John Baker Church. Rensselaer takes over. He joins the government. He works his way up in New York State politics, becomes lieutenant governor, runs for governor unsuccessfully, goes back, becomes lieutenant governor again, and eventually decades and decades go by, and the American Revolution, the founding is coming to an end, but I still, as you know, consider the War of 1812 part of the American founding, and as someone who was in the militia for his whole entire life, and a leader, Stephen Van Rensselaer is actually chosen. He's running for governor against Daniel D. Tompkins. Tompkins would later go on to be vice president of the United States under James Monroe. He's running for governor of New York against Tompkins when the War of 1812 breaks out. And Rensselaer was a Federalist, and Tompkins was a Democratic Republican. So Democratic Republican president of the United States, James Monroe, concocts a plan to appoint this gentleman running for governor of a very important state from an opposite party. He appoints him to lead a command as a major general in the state militia, thinking this would stop him from running. It doesn't stop him from running. He ends up losing anyway, but that's largely because of what happened. What follows is the Battle of Queenston Heights. Now, this is a time where the militia still played a very important part in war. However, Major General Stephen Van Rensselaer III goes to upstate New York to get his men, and he gets his men, but militia are in no way required to leave their state. They weren't during the Revolutionary War either, though they generally did during the Revolutionary War as something called levies. That's a different story. People were more willing to fight in that war than necessarily the War of 1812. So he calls together his militia, and technically he is in command of the United States Army soldiers there also, because he's a major general and there's only brigadier generals around. But the United States Army refuses to take orders from a local militiaman as they see it. Again, one of the wealthiest people of all time and a major general in the local militia, just a militiaman, right? So he leads a battle into Queenston Heights, Canada, across the water, because that's what he was ordered to do by the United States government. And many of his men don't join him because they don't have to, and the United States Army doesn't join him. So he is well undermanned. And he gets across, and it is a significant defeat for the Americans, which is super sad for the Americans. Not for the Canadians, I suppose, but for the Americans, it's super sad. And it's very sad for Van Rensselaer, who's like not disgraced, but like very embarrassed by the whole ordeal, because he takes the whole blame for this, even though it's like, what am I supposed to do, man? What are you guys doing here? Give me something to work with. Anyway, he does go back. He resigns, although he would remain as the highest ranking major general in the New York State Militia for the remainder of his life. He also would be elected to the United States House of Representatives. And while he's there, this is a little interesting tidbit. He was part of the group that, when John Quincy Adams was elected president, there was not a majority between him, Henry Clay, William Crawford, and Andrew Jackson. But it goes to the United States House of Representatives, where apparently Rensselaer was the deciding vote in New York to vote for John Quincy Adams, and get John Quincy Adams elected to President of the United States. So he would go back and spend the rest of his year joining things. I mean, so Van Rensselaer started a bunch of banks. He started insurance companies. He served on the Erie Canal Commission. And, oh, that's right, I meant to say this before. The Hudson River was super important, because you're trading furs and you're trading all this stuff out of Albany. And then once they get the Erie Canal built, now suddenly every product in the West, because you know, at this point, the Americans, by the time the Erie Canal's there, the Americans do take over the Mississippi River, but most products out west, and many of the people who are traveling back and forth, now they don't have to go down and out the Mississippi River. Now they can go from the Great Lakes straight to the Hudson and down through New York City. And it makes New York City one of the wealthiest cities in the world. And because I bring this up because Van Rensselaer helped promote the Erie Canal and served on the Erie Canal Commission for a great amount of time. He also started a bunch of different schools, including what really seems to be his pride and joy, the Rensselaer School, which is now called the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, RPI, which is a fairly renowned school for Albany, New York. But no, it's a fairly well-known school, a good school. And he created that with a gentleman, Amos Eaton, who himself is very interesting, and I'm thinking about doing a video on him maybe next week, maybe Monday or Tuesday. When he died, a few years later, Stephen Van Rensselaer III had approximately $3 billion net worth. Now, I'm not talking about today where $3 billion is a lot of money. I'm talking about in 1839, where $3 billion was an obscene amount of money. For inflation, that's about $101 billion today is what he'd be worth. And again, that ranks him 10th among all Americans ever. What's super interesting that comes out of his death is his son, Stephen Van Rensselaer IV, takes over as Lord of Rensselaerwyck, their manor. And he's Lord for about a year and a half. And he's the last one. Because this is 1840. And the ideas that were put forth in the American Revolution and in the Declaration of Independence, they weren't saying this is what we have right now. They were saying this is what we hope for in the future. This is what we're fighting for. Just because we don't have it doesn't mean it's not what we're looking for. And a lot of people, specifically people who were essentially serfs to the land on these feudal manors in New York State, well, they were like, well, what's this about? Additionally, Stephen Van Rensselaer III, who we've been talking about, was very good to his people. You can see how being a feudal lord could be bad for the people. Van Rensselaer was very good to the people. If people couldn't pay, he let them pay late. He'd often let them pay in the products they're growing or some other fashion to make up for their debt. He wanted it to be profitable, much like his ancestors 150 years before who started Rensselaerwyck. They wanted it to be profitable, and often the best way to do that, you know, for business owners out there, you treat your employees good. Give them health insurance. Pay them more than minimum wage out of the goodness of your heart. And they will work harder for you because they appreciate what you're doing for them. And that was essentially Stephen. I'm not a business owner, so I don't know if that's true or not. But that was Stephen Van Rensselaer III's attitude. And it worked until he died and his son Stephen took over, the fourth. And he wanted people to pay on time. And he raised some of the rent. And that broke out into the anti-rent wars. And we're getting into after the founding now. But broke into the anti-rent wars or anti-rent riots. Which these people were like, why are we tied to this? Like, why? The American Revolution was 60 years ago. Why are we behaving like it's 1300s Europe? And this was such a powerful enough movement that not only, like, they weren't really wars, there were some violence and such, but actually a party erupted, or a party started, and the party got, I forget the gentleman's name, but got someone elected governor of New York who was anti-riot or anti-rent. And when I say anti-rent, they weren't actually like, we don't want to overpay rent. They were like, what, why are we feudal, essentially? And what happened was, the main thing that came out of this is New York changed the laws and other states followed, although truthfully New York was really the only one with a manor system because it was the one with the most Dutch heritage. And like the Rensselaers and Abraham ten Broeck, they spoke Dutch as a primary language. For them, it probably wasn't their first language anymore, but they spoke it. But the anti-rent wars ended up saying, like, now in New York, if you rent land or property, you sign a lease for a certain amount of time, and then you cannot sign that lease when it's over, and you're not responsible for that property anymore. And that was a major change in how rent was done. Now, I know I got a little bit out of the revolutionary and founding era at the end here, but like I said, I put a lot of time learning a ton about this week, so I really thought I might as well share with you guys. You guys are interested in just about that time. Figured you'd like to know that too. So again, on these Wednesday calls, there's generally not a lot of questions, so thank you so much for coming. Come on Friday where we play trivia and there's a lot more interaction. That's a lot of fun. And tomorrow, like I said, I'm gonna go live tomorrow at 8:15 Eastern Standard Time, which I don't usually do on Thursdays, but I'm doing my Founders Fantasy Draft rankings, and it might sound dumb, and it probably is, but I have a lot of fun. I put a lot of time into making the list, and I've actually put a lot of time into like setting up the screens. It's not gonna be as impressive as it sounds, but you know, I'm sure you guys will be really upset at some of the people I pick, and I'm going to go through 100 names, so I'm going to go through them pretty quick, so you guys can shout out your arguments as I go. I'm probably going to ignore them, but if you want to talk about at the end, I'm hoping to get it done in about an hour and a half, which is a little bit late for Thursday night, but, you know, it's Thursday. It's Thursday. 100 names. If I can do each one, if I can do each one in 30 seconds, that's 50 minutes. So that's about an hour. That's the goal, and that's what we're going to do. So we'll call it for tonight, guys. Thank you so much for watching. This is always a pleasure for me to be chat-shitting with you guys about the American Revolution and the American founders. So thank you so much, and I will be back with a list of the top 100 founders, which, believe it or not, just side note, it does change every year based on what I've learned about people and how that reflects on my understanding. So I'll put a link tomorrow in the description saying, to the first 2 years. This is my third year doing it. So you can compare and contrast and see how things have changed. I will be back tomorrow, and I'm going to leave you with a round bottom. See you guys.